Welcome back to Liminal Frames, your interdimensional spectacle dealer where we try not to make too much of a spectacle out of the phenomenon. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host and co-conspirator, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, happy, I guess we're almost toward the end of the week here. How's it going? What's going on with you? Spring is on the way. And today was a beautiful day here. I don't know how it was for you, but I really enjoyed stepping outside and taking the stroll.
Neon fan, it was a great day, wasn't it?
Perfect cabin.
So for people who don't realize, Nathan's always posting these this AI art, and he really seems to prefer neon colors. So I thought Neon Nathan would be a good nickname. Then I thought, wait a second, I've got ExoAcademian. So maybe Neon Fan or something like that would be his moniker. What do you think?
I think it's fantastic, and I couldn't help but respond today with a little bit of a Tron inside joke. A great movie, by the way, Tron, and also the more recent Tron. And I heard they're even going to make a new Tron. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I've always been a fan of neon and also psychedelic colors. They're just, that kind of vibrant energy speaks to me. I started a thing called Wallpaper Wednesdays now. So every Wednesday, I'm just putting out some phone wallpapers. People need some fresh paint on their phone. So you can pick that up if you follow me on Twitter. I take care of the art, and you take care of the deep thoughts. That's kind of how it's been going lately.
That's right. So it won't be a surprise to people that the bright colors that are part of the Liminal Frames logo and artwork was also from Nathan. Those are his go-to colors, pretty much.
Man, it's hard to go wrong. I mean, you can't beat a good purple and green, man. That's been a whole fun journey, the AI stuff. And I feel like, just like a lot of folks, I'm part of that AI trend right now. It's everywhere. You can't turn around without bumping into some sort of GPT of some kind. And it's a strange place to be, but also an exciting time. But a time sort of ripe with a ton of potentiality, and just sort of like the potentiality that exists inside the atom, right? We know it can be really powerful and good, and it can be incredibly destructive. So that's sort of what I'm feeling lately.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You and I have been talking about this for a while now, just how, many people are still unaware of how much this is sneaking up on us, like this, this sleeping giant that's quickly waking up, and the way that it iterates so quickly, and the way that it's so spreading into our society and sort of every industry you can imagine, not only how disruptive it'll be to economies potentially, because we don't really plan these things ahead of time, right? When you have a free market system, again, this is one of the weaknesses of that, is that when you have real systemic change like this, there's no capacity to prepare for it, really. And even if you did try to, hold hearings or something and begin to walk through the red tape of thinking about how we should actually regulate AI, by then it's probably you're in Terminator, territory kind of thing, where it's too late. So, like you said, it's interesting looking back at our history, even for our age group, and sort of realizing there's been these different technologies that every time they roll out, people were like, this is bad. This is going to be the end of society. Other people are like, well, this is real opportunity for growth and change. And both of those are true. And it's true here as well. Like AI, by the way, people, the show is not on AI, but we kind of got here, and these are things Nathan and I have talked about recently, just how it does hold great potential to transform our society. Many of the ways that, communist and socialist ideals in the past have always failed, because you get the human factor that comes in that's always corrupt and inefficient, and you kind of get the in crowd that looks out for themselves over and over again. Here you have the potential to really just run pure computational power at this thing and solve some major global issues potentially, even in some ways that we don't necessarily understand how it gets to the answers, because it kind of accesses these kinds of questions from a multidimensional kind of matrix. And yet, on the other hand, because of that, by that very notion that we don't know how it gets there, we could hand it certain questions, and it could go in directions we never planned for, even directions that may be detrimental to the survival of our civilization potentially. So these we're not even exaggerating. This is not sci-fi, Saturday or something. This is real issues we're facing. And as Nathan and I were talking about before we went on the air tonight, I don't think it's even a coincidence that this is happening in the midst of this sense of something with the others going on in our midst. There's so many things going on in the world right now that make it seem like we really are on the precipice of something major, whether it's, the potential of nuclear warfare because things are really ramping up and we seem to have a new Cold War kind of brewing with the positioning of different groups and different nations. And some of these is a lot less clean than the old Cold War, right? And on top of that, you've got, biohazards. We look back at what happened with COVID and that kind of thing and how that could be weaponized. And many people having, concerns that was part of a weaponization of these kinds of things. Then, you've got the war in Ukraine and Putin becoming more and more cornered, like an animal that really sees no way out. And on the one hand, certainly he's committed some war crimes, but on the other hand, when you corner an animal, you give it fewer and fewer choices. And this is an animal that's sitting on the button to, detonate nuclear weapons. So tricky times. And then when you add to that the sense that so many experiencers that I'm talking to are having the sense of something major with them being in the midst. And this also relates to what I've been talking about in recent podcasts, just how there's this sense of these two factions and something happening in the world. And when you look at as we said before we went on the air, when you look at the situation, take the others out of it, you just look at the situation, it sure looks like a powder keg that's just waiting to blow.
Yeah, it makes me think of that game from childhood, the musical chairs, right? Here, put the kids in the room, take one chair away from the number of kids that are there, you play some music and they walk around the chairs and you stop the music and everybody gets to sit down, stays in the game, and the person that didn't get to sit down, they're out. Till eventually you get down to that last chair, and I don't know if you've ever witnessed this or remember it from your childhood, but it gets really violent when that last chair is in the room, and there's some, come to blows. The chair sometimes explodes because people are getting onto that thing so fast. So it's a very tenuous time, and I think with AI, it's not really too far to say that we're dealing with a kind of alien intelligence, and as you said, the inner workings of it, how it arrives at its conclusions, we may not be able to comprehend that. And there's I think there will be a lot of calls to say, well, we need to understand this better. How do we understand this? How does it do what it's doing? We need more data. We need to get scientists and academics to kind of study this more intently and figure out how it's doing what it's doing. And I think we're reaching a point where even that effort might not be able to understand it, to comprehend it. And I think that's a great parallel to sort of what we're dealing with more broadly with the non-human intelligence from the phenomena, what it is doing, what it means. And there are a lot of calls recently for the same thing. We need better data on the phenomena. We need more sensors, more analysis, more PhDs. We need it to be taken more seriously, because if we can just throw enough knowledge, academics at whatever this is, well, then surely we're going to figure it out. And by figuring it out, we'll have a semblance of control and mastery over it. It's worked for us before, right? We've discovered there are these things called germs, and by throwing our scientific effort at germs, we've got a little bit of a handle on how they work, and understanding that washing your hands is a good idea. Nevertheless, germs are still there; they're still killing people, right? So understanding it and stopping it from doing whatever it may do are two different things. But we want to tackle this issue of, and I think that this premise, right, that we can understand the phenomena through the means that we understand everything else that happens in our world today, through the means and methods of materialism and physicalism and the scientific method. Are these the tools that are going to work in helping us to really get our arms around what this is, or is it something beyond that? So what are the benefits of that approach, and where does it fall short? Where do you start with that?
Well, a couple things come to mind. One is that, I am friends with and in association with a lot of experiencers. And I think from our perspective, this is an opportunity to be vindicated in front of the public eye, right? To actually have people who are respected as being able to determine whether or not these things are quote unquote real, come in and apply the scientific method, run some experiments, prove, quote unquote, that it's real and that it's not something conventional or prosaic, and in so doing, indicate people who've spent decades and decades either experiencing ridicule and scoff and questions about their mental health, or they've had to just stay in the shadows and not talk about it because they know darn well that's what they'll run into. So even just today, I was dialoguing with someone on social media who, for the first time, has come out and talked about the experiences they've had, and they're in their 70s now. This is the first time in their lifetime they've done this. And even then, they talked about basically being in tears as they pushed, send on that social media post, right? Because they know what, even today, what that means, right? And there's so much emotion wrapped up in decades and decades of having these experiences and not having any place to talk about them, to digest and work through them, right? So I think about that when I think about this push for academic involvement. I think there's also people on the nuts and bolts side, so not so much experiencers, but the nuts and bolts side, who in their own way are convinced something's going on, that there is a there, as we say. They know that going back to Roswell and before, there's just been a massive cover-up. Therefore, they believe the evidence must exist. And maybe they have not gone too far down the woo road yet. So they think that academics coming in is a great idea. And this is going to be our Shangri-La moment where we suddenly, it's in their mind, it's just about getting academics involved. And once that happens, then everything else will follow. But perhaps that's a bit naive. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind. Skinwalker Ranch, for example, all the experiments and technology that are thrown at that mysterious place. And if you've watched the show, which I encourage folks to see, I think it's entertaining and interesting, fascinating. But many times bizarre things happen, and they're non-repeatable things. It's like, well, it's messing with our instruments in this way, and it's totally messing with them in this other way, and we can't quite pin it down. We can't get that reproducibility that we crave with our scientific approach to understanding things. And I think about the work of Jacques Vallée, of course, where he and J. Allen Hynek took a scientific approach to this, and kind of came away many times scratching their heads. I think about Hal Puthoff and and the work that he did. Many similar examples of it just being really confounding and not adhering to the rules, right? It's sort of like you get in that situation where you're trying to play a game with someone. You're like, here's the game, here's how the rules are, and they just ignore the rules entirely, and they're like, I win. And you're like, no, you're not playing the game according to the rules, so you're not playing the game, you're doing something else. And that's kind of where we are. It's sort of demanding that reality as we experience it conform to our notions of what is possible, to our possibility space. I also think about the recent paper that was co-authored from Avi Loeb and Sean Kirkpatrick that a lot of folks got pretty upset about because the bounds of the possible were quite narrow in that paper, even though it has been the source of a lot of clickbait articles about motherships and our solar system and things like that. But the possibility space of what alien technology can do was confined to essentially the things that we think are the limits of physics. And folks who have had experiences of this technology, or even looking at incidents like the Nimitz, of course, the famous incident there, will say, well, then how did it do that? If it's doing that and our sensors are saying that and the witnesses are saying it's doing that, then clearly something is happening outside of the bounds of what we would consider to be possible. And so, again, we've just got many examples here of the limits of our understanding, and I think the frustrations of our attempts to understand this, and pointing to what we've been hinting at here, and that's just throwing academics at this may not necessarily yield the results that we want. And is it going to come down to needing that kind of proof for people to take it seriously? Like, is the world going to need academia to say, well, yes, we have reproduced this, and therefore it is real? Or is it going to be, is it going to sort of transcend that or exceed those bounds and create something new that is maybe a kind of fusion of what we understand science to be, but also to some degree what we understand things like mysticism to be?
Yeah, great points. I have several things occur to me. One is that the reason why I think it's misplaced hope to suggest that academia is going to come in and, number one, be able to reproduce it. That's our first question, right? The second one is, even if they could, how much would that really change things? And the reason I bring that up is because there has existed pretty compelling evidence from parapsychological research for going back like 150 years, just even going back prior to the quantum revelations, right? So, and yet it really hasn't changed our society. Most people that you talk to in the public believe in some sort of psychic capacity, right? But it doesn't really filter into the way academics think about these things. It has not caused the revolution that it should have. So I think that's the first thing I point out to people, is the evidence alone does not necessarily change these human institutions, even ones that supposedly are supposed to be about pursuing truth. That even while we want to look back at religious history and say, in the medieval world, the church had its grip on reality, and they could define the reality model of the day, and that was, passed aside and eventually overtaken by this scientific revolution, which is all about this pioneering spirit of what is, and we will just be completely honest and forthright about this, and we'll go anywhere the data takes us. Gosh darn it, all of that's a bit naive. Like, there's definitely, that's the spirit of science, and there are many, many scientists working with that hope in mind, that underlying set of principles in mind. And yet, human nature just gets in the way, right? Even when we mean well, it just gets in the way. Partly because we've evolved in such ways that we do make assumptions all day long. We have to make assumptions just to get through the world, because there's so much data, we would be completely overwhelmed if we didn't make assumptions. But because of that, and because physicalism is the dominant paradigm and has been for several hundred years, it makes it so that these assumptions just never get questioned, right? So that's another thing to bring into the mix, is what assumptions are baked into any dominant paradigm, whether it was the Catholic Church and, several hundred years ago, or it's physicalism today in the Western world. These are things to think about. Another thing that occurs to me, going back to the paper put together by Kirkpatrick and Avi-Loeb, is that we were talking about this before we went on the air. It's like so Star Trek. It's right. I think, mothership comes in, sends out the scout probes that go down to the planet. They do some stuff. They go back up. It's like almost like Battlestar Galactica from the 70s. Like, it's so like traditional sci-fi, right? That it's kind of laughable, because the reality is, as we've talked about many times, these things have been here longer than we have, right? So it's not even, this notion even that they're coming to our planet is laughable, right? They were here long before we were. It's not our planet by any stretch of the imagination. We have all sorts of evidence pointing to, and I've seen evidence suggesting that, they have bases in the ocean, right? And that it's not coincidental that we see them going in and out of the ocean so many times. It's because they don't have to go back to a mothership, somewhere else in the Milky Way. They have bases right here, right? Even the moon is hollow, and there's things going on there, right? People have suggested this for a long time. I would say that's true. So these are all things that kind of make laughable this notion that the mothership is like, docked, and then, you got these scout craft coming out. But getting beyond that, I think it would be helpful to first identify what is the scientific method, right? What are the assumptions in science? And to what degree can that apply here, right? And I think there's different directions we want to go, but we really want to, first of all, I think, be clear about what it is, right? And then think about the nature of the phenomena, right? And the phenomena, as you rightly point out. And how much is that the kind of thing that can apply in these circles? Because one thing, I was saying to you before we went on the air, is that science can only answer scientific questions, and not all questions are science questions. So let me mention some things here, and we can sort of bounce off it from there. So one of the assumptions of science is that one is determinism, right? The assumption that all events in the universe, including behavior, are lawful or orderly. The second assumption is that this lawfulness is discoverable, okay? Quick aside there, by the way, that's very interesting, because as much as science was in many ways trying to stand against what they saw as the irrationality of the church, when you think about these kind of terms, right, lawfulness and order, it actually arises out of very early science, which came out of Christendom, where there was a sense that there was this, God at the center of the universe that set forth these eternal laws, and it was those laws that governed the natural world. So it's very interesting how you still see that kind of language baked into scientism, right? Very, very interesting. And let me say three other things. So again, this is about the assumptions. Nature is orderly, and the laws of nature describe that order. Number two, we can know nature. Number three, all phenomena have natural causes. We assume that nothing we see is unnatural. If it occurs within nature, then it is a natural occurrence. And if it's a natural occurrence, we assume that it obeys some natural law, and that by observing it, we can learn about it. And then the scientific method, how is that defined? The basic process involves making an observation, forming a hypothesis, making a prediction, conducting an experiment, and finally analyzing the results. And as part of that scientific method and running these experiments, you have the independent variable, which is changed during the experiment, right? This is the thing you're trying to toggle to see what kind of effect it has. Then you have dependent variables, which is what's measured during the experiment. When I change this one thing, how does it impact this other thing? Then you have the controlled variables that stay the same during the experiment. And then finally, you conduct the experiment several times to make sure the results are reproducible and not random. So that's what we're talking about in terms of what people hope that academics are going to apply here, right? And so then that raises the question, to what degree does the phenomena that we're aware of and that is attested to in the literature fit within those parameters? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, a lot of things there. I think about the conception of sort of God being the watchmaker, right? That there's, and like you said, that there's this inherited order to the process that came from this conception of the divine kind of ordering everything that there is and setting it into motion and kind of stepping away and just letting the clock do its thing, but every gear being specifically designed to tick at a certain interval, etc. So that conception very obviously has been borrowed, which makes sense, right? Those who grew up and became kind of the first pioneers of the scientific method, let's not forget the world in which they found themselves, the world in which they were born, was steeped in that kind of conception, which is also quite old. This notion of laws, immutable laws, and order. So it makes a lot of sense that they would take that understanding and kind of take God out of the equation, and then just put themselves into that blank spot, right?
The watchmaker.
Exactly. So, I certainly think about that. The other thing I think about here is something that we've said before many times, and that's, sort of not confusing the map for the territory, So, and here, I'll use a little different example. We all are familiar with kind of the classic lab rat maze experiments. You put the rat in the maze and you kind of let it do its thing. and you're studying its behavior, how it reacts to certain stimuli. It's looking for a treat, for example. But it's essentially saying, well, the maze is in fact reality, the way reality actually is. It's confusing the maze for the way things actually are in the world at large. The maze is very carefully constructed, crafted, ordered, etc., and obeys very specific kinds of rules. And the world at large isn't like that at all. There are many, many, many more variables than that that are at play in the maze. And to be able to take learnings from the maze and say, well, the world is just like this is a bit of an assumptive leap, right? It's not to say that there isn't some degree of correlation. And I think that the correlative power is very, it's immense, right? We've seen a lot of instances where science has been able to reproduce things through the scientific method and apply them at large, and it's very, very powerful. But just because it can do that doesn't mean that that's actually how reality works in the broadest sense of the term. It just means that we've gotten really good at that one sort of manipulation. And so, those are the things that kind of swirl around my brain when I think about this issue. That there is a benefit to doing it, to applying the scientific method to the phenomena, and I think we should, and we are, and there are people who are doing that. But my worry is that the tools that we're bringing to bear on this just really aren't the right tools that will ultimately help us understand what's actually happening. And quite frankly, we may not have the tools or ever have enough tools to really get our arms around this, at least in the lifetime that you and I consider to be, this incarnation of our human experience.
Right. And what I think of here is the fact that most of the general public is going around assuming that we have most of the laws, quote unquote, of nature figured out. And we're just, polishing at this point, right? Just crossing the T's and dotting the I's, which again, we've talked before about the irony is that same sort of hubris was in play prior to the quantum revolution, right? People really thought that it was just, fine tuning the details, the fine print, but everything else was pretty much figured out. So when people talk about academics coming in, they assume again that we have a mostly complete model of reality. And therefore, finally, we can see how the UFO phenomenon fits within it, right? But as you pointed out, there's a big difference between being able to observe how nature behaves, what we call nature, versus what nature actually is underlyingly. And what science does really well, what the scientific method does really well, is it begins with some assumptions, and then it says, what can we play with here in terms of the variables to produce a certain outcome? You can do that without having any idea of actually what is underpinning all of those variables, right? You could, before someone had ever heard about a waterfall and rain clouds and precipitation and this sort of convective way that, climate works on the planet, well before knowing any of that, they could see that, hey, if we go downstream, we can gather water, right? So you can observe that behavior and, you can say, hey, it's a good idea to build our village right here by the water because it gives us so many things that we need for life and even for conveying things along. We need to send it downstream. But you can do all of that and have really effective, changes to your civilization as a result without really understanding any of the mechanisms that provide that water to begin with. And that's kind of what we're doing. And on top of that, because that's all we're really concerned about, that's what really most people are concerned about is how does it change our lives? And if it makes our lives better and easier, then, hey, you guys are like the new priests, you're in charge, you're doing a good job. You say it's because there's a physical reality that underpins everything. Works for me because, I've got a microwave oven and a cell phone and blah, blah, blah. But of course, those questions are very much in play. And not only that, but there's mounting evidence, and there has been for a very long time, that actually physicalism as a final fundamental model is flawed. So That's very, very interesting in terms of the timing here, right? Because we're talking about bringing in academics to see how the phenomenon fits within this model when, secretly behind closed doors, people are saying, well, the model's flawed. The model is actually not tenable. So, see what I'm saying? It's kind of a weird erosion happening from both ends. And then you've got some things that you actually can test. I want to make this clear. Again, parapsychological research. Dean Radin and IONS has done some great work in showing how you can make a prediction, you can set up an experiment, and you can demonstrate it, right? Again, what's shocking about that is that the evidence exists, and yet it hasn't really eroded our faith in physicalism, both within the scientific community and with the society at large, even though it should have. So these are some things to keep in mind before we even get into what I think we'll get into next, which is what are the actual things we notice with the phenomena, right? What kind of observations are made? What kind of experiences do people have? And how might that or might that not fit well with something you could test in a lab kind of situation?
Yeah, and along those lines, I think here too about the very personal nature of the experience. That it's not like the experience of going to an ATM machine, right? Which, but for the kids around here, an ATM is where you go and you put in some numbers in a card and you get something called cash. It's made of paper, and you carry it in a wallet and you pay things. You use that to buy things. Nobody uses that anymore. But every time you use an ATM, it's the same experience, right? It's you punch in, they put in the card, punch in the number, get the cash, and walk away. That's pretty much it. But the nature of the experiences that we hear about with the phenomena are not at all the same, from person to person. And there are many, many factors that go into that. The feelings are not the same. The reported experience or resemblance or whatever it is, their experience is not the same. And it kind of begs the question, and we've touched on this in different ways, and that's, what's really happening here? And is it something that we can point to in the way we could describe ATM machines, or is it something that is meaningful and designed in its very nature to be meaningful only to that person? It's a lot like the way too. I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here, but growing up being the son of a minister, I would sit inside church week after week and listen to sermon after sermon. And my dad, I thought, was an excellent preacher, and he is. But one of the beautiful things about the sermon, if you hear good preaching, is it's not necessarily what is in the sermon. It's what it elicits in the listener. It's the experience that is evoked by listening to that sermon. And of course, you hope that it translates into some change in that individual's life, right? And so I think a lot of the phenomena, a lot of the experience that we hear about is much like that. It is evocative. It is not necessarily designed in a reproducible way, because it's spontaneous and responsive to who that person is and who they are in that moment. Not only in that moment, too, we've talked about this quite a bit, but even throughout the course of their life, right? So it's that funny way that time works, where you can re-examine an experience 20 years later and say, aha, this is what it really means. I needed to live this part of life to fold that experience back in and really understand what it was about. But it also meant something to me when I was 20, just as much as it means something to me now that I'm 60. And it's richer for it, both then and now, right? You see what I'm saying? Like there's a dynamism to it that doesn't exist in the kind of linear, neat packaged way that our scientific experimentation typically functions.
Indeed. And what you just talked about there reminds me of my discussion about Jacques Vallée's control system hypothesis in the most recent episode of Point of Convergence, because he made that very point that the question about the reality of UFOs kind of misses the point. It only needs to be real enough for people to believe it's real. Because if the ultimate goal is to change behavior, so taking his notion here that this is about, on the most macro scale, some sort of other intelligence or groups of intelligences trying to mold our civilization, trying to evolve our collective consciousness, then really the reality of the tools they use, the mechanisms they use in order to accomplish that goal kind of is secondary, right? The main point is, how do you do it in such a way as to mold the trajectory of the civilization? And so his point is that we shouldn't ask whether or not UFOs are real necessarily. What we should ask is, are they real enough to change behavior? And let's take it beyond UFOs. Let's go back into religious history, right? And even things like fairy lore, which he, again, has done a great job in that kind of comparative analysis with medieval fairy lore in Europe and, ancient religious traditions. And in each of those cases, let's look past the superficial veneer and ask, what was the nature of the experience and how did it change behavior? How did it even change that group's understanding of what reality is, right? And what they should do and how they should live. These are the kinds of questions that Vallée really brought to the fore. And if that's the kind of endeavor we're talking about here ultimately, then that's very different than saying this is some sort of natural phenomena, right? Because again, this is the point in science, is that supposedly if this is happening in the natural world, then it's based on lawful order, and we should be able to observe it, make predictions about it, and prove its existence and how it relates to everything else in the natural world. But again, I think Vallée's work really helped to demonstrate that makes so many assumptions. And, this brings up to mind one thing I thought we could get into, and I know that you've read this as well, the three-body problem. So why don't you talk about that book and how that maybe impacts this conversation as well?
Yeah, that's a great one. So if you haven't read it, The Three-Body Problem from Cixin Liu, an excellent trilogy that has also been made into a miniseries on Chinese television. So you can find that around the internet if you're looking for it. But it plays a lot of different ideas and themes around what it would mean to be in touch with, non-human intelligence, alien intelligence. And I think kind of challenges some of those classical assumptions. And it plays with the way in which we kind of normally understand what should happen or what can happen, to the degree that what this intelligence does essentially kind of remotely from a distance. And apologies if you haven't read it and don't want to know, this is the place to hit the pause button of the episode and, fast forward 20 minutes or something. But essentially this intelligence messes with the scientists of humanity and kind of confronts them and confounds them with information that just doesn't fit into the kind of paradigm that they're used to seeing, and it often drives them mad. Basically, they kind of lose their sanity. So it's, in a way, it's almost like a psychic attack on humanity, because it's something that disrupts the ways in which we can understand what is possible or is not possible. And to the outside observer, this appears as madness, right? It just appears as there's some kind of psychosis happening here, and that's all there is to it. But then as they get savvy to what's really happening, the kind of powers that be have to make a decision to sort of covertly, respond to this hacking, if you will, kind of the way to think about it, like a hacking of humanity. Covertly respond to it by this incredible layered secrecy and separation of intelligences and people who are tasked with solving these issues, and because they can't reveal their hand to this alien intelligence that essentially has kind of omnipresence to everything that's happening on the planet. So there has to be this coordinated subterfuge so that it doesn't know what we're planning to do in response to it. But it's a great example, again, of what we've been talking about here, and that's the conventional means of of understanding and relating to and counteracting, and like all those things sort of fail. And if you continue to try those methods and get and understand it through those methods, it ultimately leads to madness. And that's essentially what we are seeing here too, and what we've also seen with some experiencers, right? Who continue to try to force that experience into a certain box. And the harder it is that they force it into that box, the more things begin to break, and the more that they can't cope with whatever it is that is happening. So that there has to be a degree of ontological shock, which takes place both on the individual level, but there's also an ontological shock that is happening societally, right? And so I think that there are two layers here we kind of want to think about, and that is the individual layer, because it is a very personal experience, but we have to think about it macroscopically as well. How does the phenomena impact, change, interact humanities on a societal level? And there is an interplay between the two, but it is actively happening on both layers, and has to and needs to, and if we're not going to understand it unless it does. So I think that's a big thing here, right? It's not just like, I went out into the field and I found this rock, and it's a discovery, and it turns out it's a fossil. It's a fossil of this creature that nobody knew about, and I bring it back to the village, and they name it after me, or whatever. It's not quite like that. It has to happen on that level, but also on a level that impacts that culture, and simultaneously, I would say, and I would argue that is what is happening right now.
Yeah, and getting back to the three body problem, one thing that's kind of introduced to the mix in that book, or that series, you say it's a trilogy, is that we assume that there's this natural order that we can measure. And we assume we're so familiar with, so accustomed to being king of the hill, right, the top dog, that we don't really take into consideration, nor really test for, because we've never had to so far, the possibility that some other influence could actually mess with the variables before we ever get to them, right? And so this again brings to mind what you mentioned earlier with Skinwalker Ranch. And John Alexander coined this term precognitive sentient phenomena to describe what they observed when they tried to follow the scientific method, right? These were groups of PhDs that got together and designed experiments exactly as I described earlier, that would present a hypothesis, try to test it, play with the variables, and see if you could draw conclusions about what was happening, what was the nature of this phenomena. But what they found is that not only were variables tweaked before they could even really run the experiment, but that this phenomena, the intelligence behind it, seemed to know what they were going to do, seemed to know how they were going to design the experiment before they even had a chance to run the experiment, which also brings to mind events in history, like, for instance, with the Tic Tacs and the Nimitz, how the Tic Tacs seemed to know the rendezvous point before the pilots even knew, and before maybe even the computer had supposedly randomly, right, chosen the rendezvous point. So this shows you just what's in play here. The parameters kind of get blown out, the usual parameters, right? I mean, this is what's in play here, is that we assume that reality follows a certain trajectory and exists within certain parameters, and we therefore look within that scope. But one thing I pointed out, and I brought it up again in the most recent episode of Point of Convergence, is that it's likely that a group coming here from somewhere else is not going to show up like Battlestar Galactica. That actually, because different parts of the cosmos are much older than other parts, and because of that, you would have had the chance for some civilizations to be considerably older than us. We're talking like in the millions of years at least, right? Potentially. And when you think about, again, how much we've progressed in 100 years, we began this conversation talking about AI, right? Computers didn't exist 100 years ago. And yet now it's at the place where it might either solve most of our global problems or pitch us over the cliff into disaster, right? I mean, this has happened in 100 years. So imagine what would happen in 1,000,000 years or hundreds of millions of years, right? Basically, it gets beyond our scope. We can't even imagine it at that point. So to assume that these others, if they exist, are going to show up in ways that we can measure through our current contemporary notions of physics is so laughable that I'm just shocked it's not brought up more. It's just the hubris around that. We've seen how much our understanding of the nature of reality has changed since the quantum revolution, which was only 100 years ago. So to assume that we have now reached the summit understanding of the natural world and that natural world depicts ultimate reality on top of that is humorous, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. We talked about privately recently the Truman Show, right? And it's a good analogy to what we're talking about here, because when we're talking about that kind of advancement, it's very likely that everything that we understand to be the case about reality is there by design for us to, at least that they're behind it in a sense, and we wouldn't be able to distinguish what would be natural or unnatural or whatever, because this is all we've ever known, and that they've designed the entire cage. And it's not until the cage begins to fall apart do you start going, wait a minute, like something's off here, something's strange. And even then, you're stepping out into a complete unknown when you leave that environment. It would look nothing like what you're used to seeing, or only approximately like. And this is what we hear, right? We hear from experiencers who are saying this, that like people who've had NDEs or OBEs, it's more real than real. There's a clarity to experience that I haven't experienced here. They don't want to come back into their bodies because it feels like baggage. It feels, just like it weighs them down. And you can understand why, right? If you've had an experience that has that richness and fidelity, why would you want to return to something that doesn't? And you and I have talked about this as well, and that's this notion of time. And we often, when you're young, you think a lifetime feels like forever. You think if 80, that just seems like you've lived an eternity. But as you start getting closer to that time, you realize how short it all actually is. When you watch your kids grow up in the blink of an eye, you realize it's all so very short. And when you compare that shortness to something like the span of 1 million or 100 million years, if you're a civilization that lives or has lived and occupies that space, this little 80-year sliver is essentially zero. It's like a rounding error, And wouldn't it be great if you could condense experience and learning into that kind of tiny little sliver and say, you know what, I came out of that experience and I'm glad I had it because it allowed me to fix this. And well, you know what, I still got some more work to do. Throw me back in. I'm going to fix it some more. So, that's a little bit of a tangent there, but just I think getting into this notion of scope and scale, it does change the way that we think about the phenomena and the edges, the borders of what we know to be possible. And it should confront us with those things, because our understanding now, it's absolutely ridiculous to think that the way we understand the world now is the way that it actually is. Yet every generation seems to approach it that way. And I think that, I don't know if that's just folly or we just haven't lived long enough to learn the lessons of the prior generation that would tell us otherwise.
Right. And to use your analogy of the Truman Show, what's interesting there is that, yes, the revelation is that, wait a second, this is all a setup. This is a false world that is just about producing this TV show about this guy's life, right? So he thinks that this is all real life, quote unquote, but then he realizes it's all a stage play, basically, for people to consume for their entertainment. But in that scenario, he's basically still entering into a larger world that follows the same laws, right? What we're talking about here is that the entire thing, even the laws, quote unquote, of nature, are part of the stage play, right? And that's one thing that academics are not asking, right? That's not a question in the scope, right? But that's really what we're getting at here. So I wanted to bring up some specific cases or situations that have been observed by experiencers that really do call into question whether or not these laws of nature might not just be part of a rule set of a local kind of virtual or simulated reality or a construct, right? So, for instance, Joseph Brooks has talked about this notion of perhaps these craft aren't actually in the sky. Sometimes it's just a virtual representation of a craft, or like a virtual reality. So we've talked about this before, that sometimes when our technology advances, we go, aha, that's what the UFO phenomenon is, right? So when we had VR come on the scene, we were like, aha, then maybe that's what that is. They wouldn't need to go to the effort of actually constructing a craft and, calling some engineers and some alien gray rangers, put together this craft and send it across the expanse of space. They could just project a virtual reality into the sky, and that's all that would be necessary, like a hologram, basically, right? Because again, the point being that it's about changing our behavior, making us believe that's a craft more than it actually having to be a craft. But it goes much further than that, because even Joseph Burks has talked about one time one of the prime contactees that he was working with saw something up in the corner of the room, and it was making him tear up. And so Joe Burks had this notion, just to try this, speaking of science, close your eyes. The guy closed his eyes, and he could still see it even with his eyes closed. So at first, you just assume this actually is a real phenomena in the physical world, right? Because why would you not believe that? Because it's showing up just as anything else would in the physical world. But then he finds, when he closes his eyes, then it's still there, which suggests that maybe it's being beamed right into his visual cortex or something, right? Rather than having to be a translation of something actually in the physical environment. But again, that begs the question, is it even happening at that level? I would suggest it's even deeper than that, because that's still working with our understanding of biology and physiology and blah, blah, blah. I think it even goes beyond that. I think that they are working at the substrate of this deeper structure of reality from which we get derivative things like quantum theory and space-time, right? So, and that's partly why we can see what look like violations of what we understand physics to allow for, right? And even personally, I've experienced this and when this happened to me back in 2005, I had researched the UFO phenomenon enough to know that this is something that happens. So it just sort of becomes this anomaly that hangs out in some part of your brain where you go, this thing felt real, seemed real, but then why do these certain things not line up like that? In other words, I had no hook to hang that part of the event. And what I'm speaking to is how my wife at the time and myself both saw this humanoid entity that passed through a wall and back through again. But what was strange was we both beheld it, which I'm very thankful for, because that grounds it in reality for you when you can corroborate it with a witness who also saw it. Otherwise, you might think, as I've said before, that it was just a dream or some sort of hallucination. But if you both see it, it's not likely to be a hallucination. But what's interesting is, while we both saw it, there were some slightly different details of what we saw, right? So I mentioned before, there was hair, and she saw the hair blowing. I most definitely do not remember the hair blowing, right? So why that anomaly? Like it's as if two people can experience something, but they might still get a custom version of that experience. And at what level of reality is that custom experience being provided, right? These are the questions that come to mind when we think about how is academia going to really reckon with these issues.
And let's not forget that our quantum science has already pointed out this same kind of phenomenon, right? The double slit experiment. You have two observers, one that's observing a wave and one that is not a particle. And it's all based on observation, right? And so the signs are there, and they've been there for quite some time. And, I think this really begs the question, and maybe we can spend some time on this, is, what evolves in response to this? What is the new tool set that should be used to apply to understanding this, that takes the best things from science and the scientific method, but adds to it, other elements that it ignored, and kind of folds them back in so that we can create something new that does provide us with some valuable understanding and conclusion. So what kind of thoughts do you have along those lines?
Well, speaking of the double slit experiment and other kinds of experiments that were conducted by quantum physicists, what that seems to be suggesting is that, like you said, that observation plays a key role in what ends up seemingly manifesting in what we think of as physical reality, which flies in the face of everything we had thought about the natural world before then. We assume that, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there, the tree still falls, still makes a sound, blah, 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 right? But this all gets called into question here, which on the one hand, again, speaking of our tendency to look at new technology that we come across or we develop and go, aha, that's what the UFO phenomenon is. So some people jump on the simulation hypothesis, right? And they say, well, you wouldn't render a tree falling in the forest where no one can see it because that's a waste of computing power, right? You'd only when an avatar is beholding it on the level they're on the screen, do you bother using your computing power to render something, right? Now that's neat and tidy, but again, I would just suggest to people that that's awfully convenient, that would mean the UFO phenomenon just happens to be, some version of our latest understanding of simulation based on what we've developed with video games and things, right? So again, we're back to that thing about we so quickly try to, lump it into whatever technology is cutting edge. We laugh at our ancestors and how they talked about like chariots in the sky, right? I'm like, why you call it a chariot? It's a UFO, man. But it's because that's the only notion of vehicles they had, right? So what else are they going to say? And I would also say that it's hinted at in the quantum experiments in terms of the conscious observer plays a role. But what I would suggest is that when you take all of this information together, and I don't just mean observations from the UFO phenomena in history, but also, research is being done in quantum physics, how people, like I've said many, many times, Neema Arkhani Hamed are finding deeper structures of reality beyond space-time. So they basically are showing that space-time, we already know space-time cannot be fundamental, cannot be the foundational model from which reality, manifests. And on top of that, we're seeing signs of beginning to actually test for some structure beyond that, which is very exciting. But what this all gets to, speaking of this thing about Valé's control system hypothesis, is that perhaps what we perceive as the physical world is actually a construct designed to serve consciousness, not the other way around. And I say designed to serve consciousness because, like the Truman Show, you could argue that the entire construct is set up as a school to allow for the evolution of consciousness. So you set up cause and effect. You set up people walking through a world and making decisions and seeing the consequences of those choices. But rather than those being actually real, quote unquote, it's more like, again, the point being that they learn through the behavior and the felt pressures that are applying to them that we all feel in the modern world, trying to balance various things. All of that is designed to serve the evolution of consciousness, which again speaks to Valé's overarching theory that he's proposed at different points, that perhaps they have a very specific goal in mind and they do just enough while remaining mostly out of the picture, like the Truman Show, right? He's never supposed to see the people behind the scenes, but they do just enough, the minimal required actually, to over time adjust the trajectory of our entire civilization. So that's what I think that's where I go when I think about how consciousness might relate to these others and our notion of physical reality.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for me too, we've gone into this territory several times. I think it comes very naturally for us, but a lot of our episodes have a kind of spiritual quality to them, and I think that's because for us the real deep, meaningful insight of the phenomena is this notion of conscious development, and I think we can come out on that equation being really hard on technology, right? Like saying like we're missing the point. We're spending too much effort on technology and mastering the world around us, and kind of our fixation on the gizmos, while we're totally impoverished when it comes to our own spiritual development, conscious development. But I think that there's probably, if we're being fair, there's some redemptive, meaningful value to learning the lessons of both, right? So there is something to be said, and this came to me just because what you just talked about, that there's something to be said about understanding how to tweak variables and modify a system and create something from what you have at your disposal in order to obtain a desired outcome. And that's what technology is doing. It's what we're become quite adept at doing. So there's some tremendous value in that. Now, if we can just conjoin that with the goals of developing our conscious awareness, the breadth, depth, scope of our conscious footprint, combine these two things together, and that's really kind of what you see happening. You do see there's this interplay at work between intelligences that are kind of pushing us, nudging us in this direction of this wider awareness of our fellow humans and all the other creatures that we spend time with here on this planet, and how we treat them, how we treat ourselves, etc. Yet also this manipulation of certain intelligences on us from a technological level. You kind of see these things happening from both directions. And I think that's because those lessons are very much at play on every single layer of reality, at every single layer of development for these beings and for ourselves. And so we carry these learnings with us as we go, and we learn as we go too, like this is the right time to be technological and apply a technological solution, and this is the wrong time for that. Like, yes, we could apply a technological solution. I could make my kids' life a whole lot easier by not having them do, whatever chore it is around the house that I need them to do, by just giving them a power tool or something. But it's important that they learn the value of that hard work, because it's developing who they are as a person and their character, etc. But you got to balance those things. So I don't know. That's how I think about these issues, and how I think about how I would combine sort of the kind of spiritual value and wisdom of humanity that we've inherited from our foreparents over many, many millennia, and our technological aptitude. Like, there's some beauty in having both of these things, and we live in a time where maybe, perhaps, if we're successful, we can really bring these two things together.
Yeah, that would be the ideal. And I would say a couple things about that tricky place we're in. But before we get there, I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that if it is the case, going with this notion here, that what we perceive as physical reality and all that entails, being a biological being with, pressures on you, and you live for so many decades, and then, maybe you redo it again, and you again go through reincarnation, and you still have some lessons to learn, so you go through the same pressures. But the whole point of it, just like when you go to the gym and you face resistance when you're lifting weights, it's to actually grow your muscles. And in a vacuum, you cannot grow muscles, right? And so if you think about being in between lives, or being not incarnated, right, in a state in between that incarnation, then you can't really grow your spiritual progress, because you have nothing pressing against you that you have to respond to, that you have to basically build strength around. So if we go with that notion, and what's very interesting is that we see how, in many ways, it's worked. When you look back at history, if it's true that there's been some sort of control system in terms of an overarching collection, perhaps, of intelligences that are trying to tweak things here and there to set the table for us to grow and learn around the things that matter most. You could say that we began as a species who very often warred against the tribe that was just over the hill, right? And we saw them as other, and we saw them as the enemy. There's even passages in the Bible that you can translate from the Hebrew that actually call those other tribes aliens. Very interestingly, right? I had a friend in high school had a band called Alien and a Psycho, and it was all about this particular translation from the Old Testament. But what I'm getting at there is that we went from, at first, just seeing even the same human group over the hill as something so different than us and so opposed to us, and we had to defend ourselves against them, even if it meant like driving them to extinction. We went from that to suddenly realizing, okay, it's not just about my family, it's not just about my tribe, it's not just about my nation state or my religious group. It's really about all of humanity. And then we have this, again, a further expansion of this sphere of concern and care where we go, actually, animals, seem to be living entities with some sort of spiritual capacity. And we should care for them too. We shouldn't just treat them like commodities. And many, many people who think about the UFO phenomenon also think about the others this way. I remember hearing George Knapp talking about when he heard about this notion of this being that had been captured after Roswell, but was kind of kept in confinement. George thought of that as like he felt sorry for the entity, right? Because this is what we naturally do. And George is also, like me, a vegetarian and really cares about animal rights, because the point being that this has been the trajectory, that if this is a school, if it's set up so that we learn about these important principles about who we are and the interconnectedness of everything and everyone, then you could say the experiment's working, right? We are actually learning these lessons where in many ways, I know people sometimes when they watch the news just get bombarded by negativity and derision and tension constantly. But the truth is, in many ways, it's a more peaceful world than it used to be, by some measures anyway. And most people consider a much broader sphere in terms of who we should be protecting and who we should be considering when we make decisions. So that's working to plan, you could argue. The challenge, though, is that we, more recently, again, because of this singularity we seem to be heading towards technologically that you and I talked about before we went on the air tonight, is ramping up so quickly. And the sheer computational power we're now throwing at it is so robust that we can't even anymore keep up with it or even understand how it's working. We now are at a place where our technological advancement is far outpacing our consciousness advancement. And in many ways, because we've just said, well, hey, this seems to be working, we're applying technology and it seems to be changing our civilization, we kind of are not even giving a lot of effort towards spiritual growth or these things that would matter to like a shamanic culture in the past and things like that. So we're really in a precarious situation, even where I've heard some people argue that we maybe are at an interesting turning point, a bifurcation moment where some human beings will decide, am I going to go in the cyborg route or am I going to stay quote unquote human, right? Like, of course, we already have many ways that we already are changed because of technology, but at some point we're going to have to make decisions around how much do we let technology change our biology? And how might that even impact our energetic spiritual core by doing that? Because what we're saying here is we don't really understand reality yet. So who knows what kind of deeper energetic structures we might be impacting, perhaps in less than advantageous ways, by just putting in a brain chip so we can, run a search engine check in our brain when we are thinking about a restaurant rather than having to worry about taking out a phone, right? These are really daunting questions that I think our civilization's facing.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you went there. And the analogy about going to the gym, et cetera, is really a good one, because you could envision a world where you have a personal AI. We're not far from this now, and essentially is telling you how to live every moment of your day for some sort of optimized function. And that optimized function is something that you determine or society determines. Quite frankly, you're both determining, you're kind of co-creating whatever that optimization happens to be. Or it could be optimized based on the goals of the AI for everyone. But essentially, at that point, you're just kind of executing its commands, and you've not developed on your own the discipline that you need to do these things without its assistance. So it's this digital crutch, in other words, that in many ways kind of stunts you, even though it on the surface it looks as if it's trying to help you. And we kind of even see this with some of the accounts of the others, right? Where perhaps there's a kind of a grief on their part that they have gone down the same path, and they lack something that we have. They lack a capacity that we have. and maybe it's a cautionary tale, that they wish they could turn back the clock, so to speak, and kind of do differently. But I think all of that is at play. All of that is at play with, in our understanding of this, with what's happening in reality, and that's that, you get many attempts at figuring this out. There are no shortcuts. So if you decide to go this technological path and it ends with the annihilation of your civilization, or it ends with, the robotic automation of every human being into doing a certain thing, there comes a point in time where there's a self-realization that is either beneficial or it's not beneficial for the system, the larger consciousness as a whole. And so, when we think about, what tools to use, how to approach this problem, how to solve whatever this thing is, I think we do need to step back and look at it from that larger developmental lens, right? So it's not just a matter of how can I get some data so that I can then, master this new, aspect of reality, but it's how can I understand this and how does it feed into and help with the larger development of both myself as an individual, but the world, right? If we're not thinking in that scope, we're not really there yet, right? Because as we've talked about many times, like as our consciousness develops, our scope broadens. And so if our scope is entirely, narrow to just, this scientific discovery or whatever, and doesn't take into consideration how it impacts your neighbor, how it impacts the other living creatures on the planet, our ecosystem, then you're kind of missing the point.
Right, and that brings to mind our overarching question here around how much can science play a role here? How much can academia, as it's currently structured, come in and solve some of this and answer some questions? Now, again, one of the assumptions in science that was, again, in opposition to what came before, right, with Christendom, was that there really is just random factors and it's purposeless, and there is no teleos, right? There is no sense of this heading anywhere. It's completely random. It's purposeless. Again, this is part of the irony of the modern age, is we're making it more and more comfortable to have a purposeless existence, right? And we even talk about extending our lifetimes while sort of like behind the scenes admitting that we don't think life is about anything, right? So, what are we doing that for ultimately, right? These are questions. And so one of the, I think, notions that the UFO phenomena is confronting us with, and not just UFO phenomena, but general paranormality, psi phenomena, is that perhaps actually what we see in these tweaks, where we see actually a variable seems to have been changed, that we didn't actually change ourselves. It's not one of these variables that I talked about where we're actually consciously isolating it and saying we're going to tweak this and see how it impacts everything else. It seems like something else, someone else is tweaking the experiment and the variables before we even get a chance to run the experiment, which again, I think should make us think about, is it possible that it's because it's trying to lead us in a certain direction? In other words, this kind of data should make us question this sense that life is purposeless and that the cosmos is just the random firing of some processes that have no direction and there's no intention behind the cosmos at all. These are the kinds of questions I think we should be asking. I also wanted to bring into the conversation, speaking of psi phenomenon, one thing that's really interesting is we do see some of that sometimes, where we see almost like a pushback from the cosmos when we even employ certain psychic capacities. So to give you an example, one of the things that's been tried, and I think even Hal Puthoff and some people at SRI worked on some precognition experiments. And they actually, Russell Targ was another one, I think. And they would actually invest in the stock market based on these precognitive senses that people would get, right? So they would identify people who had really astounding capacity around psi phenomena, and specifically precognition, knowing the future. And they would basically make predictions about what the stock market was going to do tomorrow or next week. And what's interesting is initially they did really, really well. right? And it seemed to be working. It seemed to be that they could, again, as we said before, one of the revelations of all of this phenomena is that seemingly there are no secrets in space and time whatsoever, right? So that, therefore, suggests that you could know what's happening on the stock market next week, right? And then get rich because of it, right? What's interesting is that while initially they did do really, really well, eventually began to fall off a little bit. And that, raises all sorts of questions. Why would that be happening? Why would you see a really robust response at first that's demonstrable and then see a fall off? There's a couple of things that came to mind or that have been suggested because of that. Speaking of trying to scientifically understand that. One is that when you have strong emotional overlay, and this comes to that question you raised about some of these others and how they kind of deliberately bred themselves away from emotion. This would be, again, a positive reason why you might want to do that, is that when our emotion gets involved, like, hey, I want to get rich, man, and I don't want to lose money, right? So you've got now this emotional overlay on top of the clean mirror of trying to see into the future. And when that's the case, what we've seen in these experiments is that they don't go as well. That if you are trying to even psychically tune into someone that you're close to, there might be more interference because of your relational overlay than if you were looking to someone that was a complete stranger, which kind of goes against our intuition, but that seems to be what is borne out in the data. So this is interesting. And you think about, even in terms of science, again, there's this phenomena called regression to the mean. So this is the notion that even if you see astounding results, it should fall back towards the average. That's basically how things remain predictable, right? We have this kind of bell curve kind of thing. So as an example here, Michael Jordan was this insanely talented basketball player, right? And he had sons who ended up being basketball players. But not surprisingly, they weren't nearly as good as their dad was, because he was so above the mean that even though they were pretty good, and I think one of them managed to get into the NBA but didn't last that long, because that's what happens. You kind of have this regression to the mean. This is part of what we notice with scientific studies. So that could also be what's going on here, right? That these psi experiments, even to the stock market, it's almost like you could even argue, again, because one of the assumptions in science is that there is nothing pushing back, right? There is nothing trying to tweak the dials besides us, right? But what we might see in these kinds of situations is actually even the conscious cosmos itself saying, oh, I notice now that you're trying to impact reality in this way, there's going to be a response. And this can even be some new scientific fact that we can discover, actually, that we find that there's actually a kind of regression to the mean here, but it's actually not just a random process. It's actually some sort of function built into the nature of what we consider physical reality, which, again, I would still say is still derivative of some deeper structure in consciousness. But these are the kind of things I think about when I think about the revelations of psi phenomena, which, again, what's interesting there is we actually have been able to test it. And some interesting and intriguing avenues I think we should pursue further have come about as a result.
Yeah, the dynamic response to our actions for a purpose that we may be blind to or becoming slowly aware of, right? That's what seems to be at work, that it is responsive. And that is what you would expect. If you're engaged with an intelligence in the way that we seem to be, then that's exactly what you would expect to see. You would see this kind of, dynamism at work, just like you do in a relationship that you have with anyone, that, you're putting forth an idea, you're behaving in a certain way, they're trying to create a relationship with you. And, as a result, they're providing feedback, and that feedback sometimes can be very positive. Hey, the way you handled this or did this was great. I appreciate that. Do more of that. That's good for our relationship together. Hey, what you did there wasn't great. If you would not do that again, that'd be great. So our relationship can grow and change in ways that are that benefit us. I think we see a lot of evidence for that. I wondered too if, like, as we kind of come to the close of this episode, maybe we can touch on just a little bit and And quite frankly, this might be an entire episode on its own. But and that is the emerging power of AI. And as a tool, as something that we can use to kind of gain more mastery of the world. Do you think that it will? What is AI's potential in your mind for exposing? Kind of what is it play here? Either overtly, will AI, in other words, kind of tell us that after scouring all this information, it's identified this giant blind spot that we didn't even know about. That's one way it might go about it, or maybe indirectly, like so. AI kind of, and the way it presents solutions to us or whatnot, might, in its behavior, reveal to us more about what makes us special in contrast to what it is doing. And that might be a hint at what is out there beyond our current sphere of awareness. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great questions. And absolutely, that's an episode on its own. But yeah, let's touch on some of the highlights. One thing that has occurred to me recently, and I've talked to different people about this. I was a guest on a show that J. Christopher King hosts on the Experiencer Group community, and one of the questions that came up was about AI. And I mentioned how we see some interesting parallels, I would suggest, between what you might call ancient technologies like tarot and what we see with AI. So I want to remind people that when I was at the Monroe Institute for this private retreat last year, one of the things we did was we went out into a meadow and we practiced CE5, right? We sort of joined together in this intention that craft or phenomena would manifest in the sky, right? And while we were doing that, there's some staff at the Monroe Institute that are ongoingly applying the scientific method. They're trying to test things and present hypotheses and see if they can get reproducible results, if they can see if their hypothesis is borne out as true. So one of the things we did was, or they did, was one of these guys that's an employee at the Monroe Institute set up a random number generator on the side of the hill next to the meadow where we were conducting the CE5 experiment. And what's very interesting is that not only did, sure enough, the random number generator become less random at the time when the phenomena showed up in the sky, because as I've mentioned before, on each night we did see things and even caught it on film, but it even went less random when we were just applying intention, shared intention, right? So we were developing this coherent field of intentionality with our consciousness alone, right? And that alone was enough to show an impact in the results of this random number generator. Now, again, according to physicalism, that should not happen. There is no mechanism within the understanding of physicalism that could impact that in any way. My consciousness is supposed to be within my skull, yours within your skull, and certainly not only are those not supposed to mix if we're sitting in a meadow in the middle of the night trying to manifest craft in the sky, but it's certainly not supposed to be able to travel across the grass up the hill and somehow impact the random number generator. And yes, that's what we see. So clearly this is saying something about our notions of reality are incomplete, perhaps even woefully misguided. But getting back to what I was saying about ancient technologies like tarot, and I call it a technology. I want to be clear about this because some people might look at that, again, with a scientific mindset, right? A typical rationalist perspective and say, this is people just reading into things, right? They randomly pull up cards and they use their subconscious to perhaps come up with some interesting ideas about what the universe is trying to tell them. And I used to believe that when I had kind of a rationalist perspective. But what I've actually found since I've changed my perspective on reality, which is interesting in itself, because as you change your perspective on reality, you begin to notice it seems to be feeding back to you some different results or different experiences of reality. As we've said before, when your worldview changes, not only do you see the world differently, but the world is different. So with tarot, what I would suggest is actually happening is somehow we are interacting with the conscious cosmos itself, and it is actually giving us some kind of information, just like we talked about in the channeling episode, right? Information that seems to be coming in beyond the parameters of space-time and without being obtained through our usual five senses. So we already see that happening with Tarot. I think anybody who really has spent a lot of time with Tarot and those kinds of ancient technologies, they see that actually somehow they're getting valid information that's useful, that's applicable, the same way that a shaman going out and figuring out which directions we go to find food tomorrow, right? They got really actionable information. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it, right? And they kept the tribe alive. Well, I would suggest in the same way that somehow AI, we see evidence already that AI is also somehow interacting with the conscious cosmos, and that this may even be part of why some of the results are coming out the way they are. So in the same way that intentionality and consciousness can impact a random number generator, so too can consciousness impact AI and the algorithms, but not necessarily just human consciousness. This is the point, right? We may now have developed tools that are at such a level that now these other intelligences can say, okay, now we can enter the fray, and through some of this AI, direct. It's another mechanism by which our civilization can be shaped, right? Going by the control system hypothesis again. And that could be good or bad, right? Depending on which intelligence it is. But, these are the things to keep in mind in terms of AI not just being necessarily pure computational power, right? It's also about how does consciousness interface with technology, right? So yeah, these are things to keep in mind. And, in terms of your other question around, will we see some sort of distinction finally and actually see that AI will never be conscious the way that we are? I would suggest yes, absolutely. And people like Bernardo Kastrup have talked a lot about this, and he's a computer scientist who also was a physicist who worked at CERN, so he knows what he's talking about. And what he sees is that we can throw as much computational power as we want at this, but that alone is not going to create conscious experience in the same way that we experience it.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that would be quite profound, right? Something that is so incredibly capable, yet is clearly still distinguishable from the human experience. And I think, kind of landing where we probably should, and that's even more the importance of using one's discernment when approaching this topic or using these tools or trying to digest the information that is happening with respect to additional disclosure elements that are coming forward. Taking that broad view, feeling out, what is at play here, and what is on the surface, and what is deeper than the surface level. Because I think the temptation, and I think you and I, we talk about this often, we see this because we see this every day. The temptation is to really just, I think, consume that surface layer of excitement or whatever it is that we're hungering and hankering for, and let that be the entire meal, right? And that's missing the point. That there is a much more satisfying, meaningful, deeper layer at work here that is the entire ball game, right? It is the issue that we can't be distracted by. In some ways, the pyrotechnics here, we have to be focused on the bigger picture, and that being sort of where we are as an individual in our own development, but also where we are as a society in our society's development. Because we ultimately we can't take a shortcut. We have to get to a place where we can coexist with reality as it is, not how we just think it happens to be. We can't approach that reality with the way we've approached reality thus far, which has led to immense amount of suffering and destruction. We can't apply the same tools that we used to use because that would be foolish. There's only so much we can do if we continue on the path that we're on. We have to look at this from a different perspective, a broader perspective that enriches the whole. And it's my hope that these revelations will help us do that will catalyze that kind of change. But that only happens if we're willing to let it do that and not get caught up in the light show.
Absolutely. And I think in conclusion, I would say here, in terms of our overarching question here about what will this produce when science engages with the phenomena, right? How will this change ufology? How will this change the world? I would say we have the opportunity that both could happen in really positive ways. That's my hope. That's the best case scenario where, yes, people within ufology and experiencers and the whole crew can learn from bringing in academics and applying academic rigor to some of our experiences and some of the data. And again, maybe with the aid of AI, we can pull out connections and correlations and important connection points that we did not see, nor could maybe we ever see with human eyes, right? That's one of the advantages with AI, is it sometimes poses questions that would never occur to us, right? So that's exciting in terms of what might come out from this. And this is where ufology and experiencers and the UFO Twitter crowd can benefit from academia getting involved. But I would also say that in the best case scenario, this also becomes a journey for those scientists, for those academics coming in, that ideally they come in and they begin to recognize, as they really wrestle with the data, that not only is it substantial and something really is going on here and there is a there, but furthermore, that it manifests in such a way as to show how our current model of reality is untenable. It adds to the weight already gathering, suggesting that physicalism is not a tenable model. And hopefully that begins to get us to ask questions as a collective about how might consciousness be the substrate for what we perceive as the physical world. And if it's true that perhaps even what I was saying earlier is true, that the entire construct is set up to serve consciousness development, then perhaps that will wake us up just in time to begin to reconsider not only how we move forward with technology, but even how technology might be ultimately not just something that benefits us, but that actually could undermine our development. And these are the kinds of questions we should be wrestling with. And perhaps this is all happening now, as scary as it sometimes seems, all of the things we talked about earlier that are co-arising right now. It may also be that just in time, we have that kind of wake-up call that we need because we really are at the precipice.
Well said. Well, thank you for listening, joining us on this journey this evening. It's always a pleasure to interact with our audience and read your comments and get your feedback. So thank you for being a part of the Liminal Frames listening community. It means a great deal to us, and we look forward to future conversations that arise. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.